So it's very intimate here with you, Doctor. It's intimate here in 92NY, and also for those who are joining us online. To have it's intimate, and that's a good thing because we're going to be talking about something that's quite personal and intimate. So first of all, welcome. It's great to be in conversation with a doctor.
Stage at Kaufman Concert Hall.
You'll have to, for a moment.
We would like to remind you that
we're next door to the venerated Kaufman Hall. I don't know if people online can hear it, but certainly those in the room. They're introducing the audience to Kaufman Hall and telling them to silence their cell phones. But
thank you.
Before I was interrupted so rudely, it's really wonderful to be in dialogue about prayer, and especially in a place like 92NY, which is, for many people, it's not seen as a religious institution, it's a cultural institution. Prayer here is a couple of times a year, maybe, but obviously as a rabbi, that's
There were the roses in the rain. Don't cut them, I pleaded.
Okay. As a rabbi, that's what I do for a living. And I think one of the jarring things about the title that you chose, which is so great, as an entree into this topic, is the juxtaposition of medicine or science with prayer, and done so skillfully in that title because it intrigues. Right? Doctor, will you pray for me is not intuitive. Right? Doctor, will you heal me in some other more scientific way? But Doctor, will you pray for me kind of invites a listener or a reader to kind of lean in. So I'm kind of curious if you'll just start us off with your journey towards being a doctor to whom people might ask for prayers. What your prayer life personally, will move a bit more into chaplaincy, into its implications, but how did you become a praying doctor?
Well, great question, and thank you for being here, and thank you all for coming. So I came to this book for a few reasons. So the title actually was said to me by other doctors, and I wrote a book a few years ago called When Doctors Become Patients, and I interviewed 75 physicians who became a patient with serious illness. And I asked them all, what do you do now as a doctor as a result of being a patient that you didn't do beforehand? What has being a patient taught you? What have you learned? Has it changed you at all? And invariably what a lot of them said is, well, patients used to say to me, Doc, would you pray for me? And I'd go, yeah, whatever. I'd poo-poo it. And then when I became a patient, I realized how important existential, spiritual, religious issues are. And there they divided. Some say, I wish I could believe something more. Some said, well, I was raised this, and then I married someone who was that, and now we do this or that or the other. But that stuck with me, that it's something that these doctors came to realize the importance of only when they became sick themselves. And I think back at my own medical education, and there was not a single lecture on spirituality or religion. And as a matter of fact, when I trained, I remember, and I trained in a large hospital in New York City. I won't say which one.
Not far from here.
Not far from here, right. But, occasionally I see a rabbi in the elevator or a priest, and it was like they were on a different planet. And I remember once I was caring for a young woman who was dying of cancer, basically, and I can tell she was Catholic. I could tell she was religious. She had a picture of Jesus Christ taped up on the wall at the foot of her bed, and at first she'd greet me with kind of hope in her eyes, and after a few weeks she was doing worse, and she'd just lie there and just look at the wall and wouldn't even talk to me, basically. I'd go in and so I said to my resident, I was wondering, should we call a priest? And he looked at me as if I said, should we call a voodoo doctor? He thought, well, what do you care?
Planet are you
who
from?
cares? Who gives a shit? Excuse me. So
you're allowed to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it was, and I thought, whoa! I was an idiot for even thinking of this topic. And then about a week or so later, I noticed that a priest visited her, and she sort of perked up. And she died a few weeks later. But I can tell he made a difference. He did something for her that I couldn't do, being there. And so that sort of stayed with me also. For myself, I come from a long line of rabbis, actually. So my grandfather, his father were rabbis. The story goes that my great-grandfather said to one of his students, you will marry my daughter. And they became my grandparents. My father rejected all that. His older brother became president of the temple, and he just wanted to play football. But I feel I sort of inherited the gene somehow. So it's sort of been in the back of my mind. But again, I was in science. I was in medicine. We're trained to be very scientific, and religion was this other thing. for me personally, and some people know this in the audience, a few friends here, but so unfortunately my sister died on 9/11. She worked at the World Trade Center, and she called her best friend in the morning at 8:30, and then no one ever heard from her again. And it was a terrible period for all of us in New York City and people all over the world, but it obviously it struck my family very closely, and no one else I knew had an immediate family member who died, and it was a terrible time. And I found myself wondering, like, why me? Why, like, no one else has to go through this extra burden? And, you know, we didn't have a body, and, like, was she gone? And it was just before the high holidays, if you remember, so we had to decide, you know, September, should we have a memorial service? Should we wait? You know, there's no body. There's, you know, should we, you know, have a grave site for her? There's no body, you know. And if you remember, people put up signs around New York of photos of their loved ones, as if the loved ones sort of wandering around lost somewhere. So I went to my temple, and, you know, actually what happened first is, so we had to empty out her apartment. I had to register, go to the FBI and register as a missing person. We did all these things, and then my body just gave out, and I just wanted to lay in bed. I didn't want to watch TV or listen to music, and I thought I had the flu. And Fred said, well, no, this is grief. I said, no, I know, but I have the flu. Because like my body hurt. It hurt to move. And they were right, of course. And I thought, here I'm a psychiatrist and didn't realize how bodily the experience of grief is, which led me to write the book about doctors becoming patients. So I went to my temple, and I went to a Buddhist shrine where we walked temple where we walked around and rang bells. And then I was just sitting in Central Park one day, and the grass was moving, and just I felt, well, there's nature sort of goes on beyond us. So for me, I realized how important that was. In other words, trying to find some meaning out of this. And I think that's what led me to write about when doctors become patients, but also was in the back of my mind that this is an important area that I wanted to come back to. And I was fortunate, I work at Columbia, and I'm on the Hospital Ethics Committee, and I've been fortunate to work with some wonderful chaplains. And they inspired me to realize these are amazing people who really fill a gap that we're not doing. So that's sort of what strands that led me to think this is an area that's important to think about and write about and try to understand and see what messages there are that can help other people on their paths.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. I mean, just to think that for you, becoming a patient, there's information about illness or about being unwell that, from purely third-person, objective, empirical, outside studying, is deficient, and that there's something about in the experience that isn't conveyed, and that is actually a lack in education is really a remarkable insight. But one would imagine that you're an astrophysicist. Here you are, you're a psychiatrist.
Right.
Right, so it's not only that there's something lacking in science per se as a medium. It doesn't encompass, right, what's going on the inside. But psychiatry is purporting to also work with interiority, with the inside of the person, their mind states, their heart states. And somehow that was also kind of, you were still on the outside. Even psychiatry and the study of psychiatry wasn't sufficient for you to know the power of or what was needed on the body, on the emotional, on the body level, right? I mean, that's clear, right?
Yes, so a few points on that. So one is psychiatrists actually are less religious than other doctors. So if you look at different specialties, do you believe in God?
Right.
Do you pray? Do you go to religious institutions? Psychiatrists are low. Psychiatrists are also more liberal. They're more likely to be Democrats. But so maybe that goes together.
Who knows?
Right. And I think part of that is because psychiatry also focuses on now, especially biological explanations of the brain. And
it's reductionist. It reduces
it's
things.
It's reductionistic. Even sort of Freud, if you're not a
very materialistic.
Exactly right. I mean, here's the cause of your distress, and we can cure it. Right. And I think what I came to realize in working on this book and writing the book is that there's psychotherapy, and then there's spiritual issues, and there's a lot of overlap. If you imagine sort of a Venn diagram, but there are things that chaplains do, and there's a world of spirituality that medicine sort of ignores. And so for the book, I interviewed a lot of chaplains and also physicians and patients and therapists and others. And I remember one psychotherapist told me, I had a patient I saw for many years, and then one day she said to me, you've never asked me if I pray. And the therapist said, well, do you pray? She says, yes, I pray every day. What do you pray for? And it turned out to be this, the therapist was shocked that she'd never even thought of asking about this whole realm of this woman's life that ended up being very important for the woman. And I think part of that is there are a lot of religious quandaries. Why me, for instance? Some of these are not, they go back to Job. I mean, they're not answerable questions. And in psychiatry, a lot of psychiatry is trying to find a solution, how to, get you back from being depressed or make you less anxious, rather than let's sit with these imponderables, because that's the reality of the universe, or these, what is the nature of the universe, or these large questions that can get into. And I don't mean to knock psychiatrists by any means, or therapists. I do,
That's what you do.
My field does very important work, but I think there are these other realms, and I should say some therapists I interviewed do recognize the importance of these realms of spirituality, incorporate it. So one psychiatrist I interviewed said, people think he's a little odd for sort of taking this into account, so I said, well, in what kinds of cases do you do that? And he said, describe, for instance, one woman who was paranoid, managed to function just barely, but her main source of support was her church. And so the thing he worked on was getting her to stay in her church and church groups. And she'd say, well, I think they're all against me, no one likes me in the church, and that's the way her paranoia comes out. But by getting her to stay there, she gets support, et cetera, is one example.
Right, so many pieces, so many threads here that are, I find, very evocative for me, and also very touching, and also part of my own personal story. Like the notion that, for example, there are questions, you use Job, so there are questions that weigh heavy on human beings by nature of being human, that are part of the full, as you said, the whole person. And that when looking from the outside, looking at the brain, you won't know how a person feels when they look at a sunset, or what memory it conjures. And that the inability to ask questions in that domain, right, is like every domain has its certain series of questions. It's kind of, that's how it works. The science asks certain questions. And so the questions a chaplain might ask, or someone who is predisposed towards spirituality, are meaning questions, meaning of things, like the church is meaningful for them. And to take that into account in the total person is really, it's remarkable, A. B, the body, and we see now a resurgence of body and trauma work and so on. And so the body keeps the score, of course, the famous book, that your body was in grief and that you mistook it for flu, is just that there is that the mind and the body and the spirit are not separate, and that in relationship with someone, chaplaincy is about being with someone.
Yes, that's right.
I heard once Swami Satchidananda was a well-known Hindu saint, and he said, illness begins with I, but wellness begins with we. And when there's a relationship that's established, and I can imagine that for you, and I just would love you to explain a little bit more about the power of chaplaincy and the power of the work that you did in helping people not only to come out of isolation through questions, but that it has an impact on their health, to something in a profound way, right? That feeling heard or feeling seen or feeling understood, as you said, that there was a slight uptick in the person's feeling better after they felt, Right. So speak more to this field and also the transformation in you as a psychiatrist. I'm so curious about how it impacted you and your work.
Yeah, so all great questions. So I think what chaplain, as you say, it's a relationship, and chaplains have developed in recent years as a profession. They've become much more professionalized. They're now board-certified chaplains. As I said, when I was an intern, there was, a rabbi I'd see because he had a yarmulke. There was a priest because he had the collar. Otherwise, you wouldn't really know.
You wouldn't know who they were. Yeah.
And that was it. Now, though, chaplains are taught to be non-denominational, interdenominational. There are chaplains who are secular. They're humanists, for instance. They don't ascribe to one particular faith tradition. There are Buddhist chaplains in hospitals.
Non-theist, yeah.
One doctor I interviewed said, when I asked, how do you interact with chaplains? He said, well, in my ward, there is a Buddhist chaplain, and I have him see everyone because he plays a harp. And he worked in oncology, and patients are often dying. And he said this is just immensely helpful to all these patients. And that's another aspect of this, by the way, is that chaplains particularly see people who are facing death and dying. And that's, I think, also where, yes, psychotherapy can play a role, but there are a lot of questions about ultimate meanings, what's going to happen to me, what happens after we die. These are imponderable questions, but people wrestle with them, obviously.
Sure.
And this is something that chaplains are well trained to deal with. And I think when, in general, psychotherapists, by the way, are also not readily apparent or available in hospitals. So in a hospital today, if you're dying of cancer, was diagnosed with cancer that's terminal, the only person who ever says, how are you doing with that? What's that like for you? Is a chaplain. Psychiatrists will only come if you need a prescription for something, because psychiatrists are in short supply. There aren't enough. They're social workers, but they tend to deal just with discharge planning, make sure do you need to go to a nursing home, get a nursing home.
So nobody takes an interest in the insides of the patient. It's all on the outside, the measurables, the quantifiables. There's no qualitative humanizing of the individual. What's their story? Also, it reminds me very much of, as I read the book, I kept thinking about narrative medicine too, and its uptick. My niece is studying narrative medicine at Columbia University, like the inside of the person,
right?
Instead of poking you and measuring you, but what's going on?
Yeah, so that's the chaplain's role, and so that's partly why I think they're so important, and yet they're underfunded.
Yeah.
They're not reimbursable directly by insurance. In the VA system, the Veterans Affairs system, they are. But outside of that, they're not, and so they're underfunded. It was about a third of hospitals had no chaplains. Now it's about 25%. Those who do have chaplains often rely on local clergy. So you just have the local priest, local rabbi come in, and they're not.
I've done that. Yeah.
Right. So, and they're wonderful people by and large, of course. But they're not trained to deal with other religions. They're not trained to deal specifically with death and dying, and also. They're often medical terms, so to know what a stage 2 versus a stage 4 cancer is, a stage 1 cancer is a different response than a stage 4 in terms of severity. So to be able to know those nuances, to know that they have different meanings existentially and spiritually and potentially religiously for patients is something that's needed. So I think I wrote this partly because I see chaplains as unsung heroes. And they fill in, as you say, lots of roles and often are mediators between patients and doctors. In the book, I tell a story, for instance, of there was a young man who was dying. His organs were going to be donated, and the surgeon said, "What we'll do is we'll wheel him and the machines were just keeping him alive. We'll wheel him into the operating room. We'll unplug the machines, and we'll harvest the organs." I hate the term harvest organs, but and the family said, "Well, can we be there when our son dies?" And the surgeon said, "Absolutely not, because the organs have to be harvested right away. You'll delay things. You'll get emotional." And the family said, "Well, then I don't know if we want to have his organs donated." And there was a clash. The surgeons and the family were at loggerheads. And so the chaplain said, "Well, let me talk to everyone." And the chaplain arranged that the family would go in to the operating room. They'd gown up. They'd be there for 2 minutes, and they'd leave. So the family went in, and when they were there, the chaplain said to the mother, "Did your son have a favorite song?" And she said, "Yes, Amazing Grace." And so they started singing Amazing Grace. The doctors joined in, the nurses joined in, everyone joined in, everyone started to cry. And then after 2 minutes were up, the family left. And as they left, the mother held the chaplain's hand and said, "Thank you so much. I got to sing my son into heaven." And that's something she'll carry with her for a long time. Here's a loss of her 20-something-year-old son. And so, it's hard to measure that. What is how do you quantify that? Well, you can't. But it's something that helps her deal with her grief. And we know grief can be devastating for families, et cetera. So I see that's the kind of role chaplains can play. And I wrote the book and used narratives because I think narratives can tell some of that story. And there have been efforts to show quantitatively that chaplains do good work in order partly to help them get funded and reimbursed. Right. And so there have been studies looking, well, if you saw a chaplain in the hospital, when you get your satisfaction evaluation on email on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate the hospitalization? One study showed that it went up, and another study showed it didn't go up. And the reason, of course, is, first of all, the evaluation, it's sort of meaningless on a 1 to 5 scale. And also, let's say your loved one died in the hospital. You're not going to say it was a 5,
it was
great
a 5.
experience, I recommend it for
Wow,
everyone.
the highlight of my life.
The highlight of my life,
Wow.
right? So, well, at the end of my life, or the end of my
Right,
mother's
end of my
life, or
mother's
whatever. Right? So the quantitative research hasn't yielded much, but
Right.
but I think the stories do,
Yes.
and that's why I wrote the book, and I tried to convey this to get people to understand, one, that we'll all have to face this in ourselves or family members, and two, that chaplains do amazing work.
It's so thank you for that, and thank you for your sensitivity to those kind. As a rabbi, that's all I do is meaning making, and how do you weigh or measure that which is, so ephemeral and so essential, and yet it's so substantial and so insubstantial all at once, right? It's the stuff that of meaning making, of life, of reflection, of memory, of right, all of the phenomenological landscape of the self. It's so rich and so intuitive that we our bodies and our hearts and our minds and our states of being are impacted by love and warmth and connection. So first of all, your story personally? Are you a chaplain?
I'm not a chaplain, no.
So okay, so I didn't think so, because I was looking for. So you're not a chaplain, but you're telling the story of chaplains. And is it your motivation, obviously, to raise them as unsung heroes, but also as a man who's dedicated his life towards mental health and towards the well-being of humans? You clearly see chaplaincy as a vital resource, an ingredient in the health of people, in the health of humanity, health of this country, right? So in your vision, what would the world look like if chaplains were well funded and there was greater access to chaplaincy? Like, what would it look like? And an addenda to that is, what does it look like now? I know there's a chapter in the book that I didn't get to read about other doctors and how they perceive the profession, like the view from doctors. Right. So I'm kind of curious about those. What's the vision of a world where chaplaincy is, and what are the resistance to it?
So great question. So I think chaplains do a number of things. So they help patients find meaning and purpose. They also, importantly, also get to know patients and therefore help with patients' treatment in a direct way. So there's indirect and direct. So one chaplain told a story, for instance, of a man who came in with abdominal pain. And he came in, had terrible abdominal pain, got $1 million workup, and they found nothing. He went home. 6 months later, he came back again to the hospital with abdominal pain. Again, got $1 million workup. They found nothing. About a year later, he came back and again had abdominal pain. And the chaplain said, well, let me talk to this guy. And the chaplain said, when did the pain start? And he said, oh, January 21st, 2020. Oh, what happened then? Oh, my wife died. And no one had asked. They knew the date. It's how long has the pain gone on? 4 years. But no one said, well, what happened then? No one tried to get the story. So as a result, the chaplain arranged for him to get psychotherapy. He went home, hasn't been back to the hospital.
Wow.
And lots of stories like that. Another case was a chaplain described a African-American woman who had a history of drug use. She'd come to the emergency room periodically, try to get drugs, and the doctors would try to not give her drugs. Then she came in once, and the chaplain sensed something else is different, that she was really in pain. And the rest of the whole ER staff said, oh, she's just looking for drugs. And the chaplain said, no, just something seems different this time. So the chaplain was on our ethics committee and knew one of the surgeons and arranged for the surgeon she knew to come down. It turned out she had a kinked bowel that was infected. And so she would have died. But because the chaplain called the doctor that she knew, the woman got treatment, and et cetera, et cetera. So,
and the chaplain was attuned to some difference in her, like something was different.
Right.
And so it was that attunement to her.
Right, and part of that is because chaplains are trained to sort of see the person as a whole person.
As a whole person.
Not to label people, sort of in the notion that there is dignity in every human being. I mean,
Yeah.
sort of I and thou, sort of Martin Buber.
Very beautiful, yeah.
Right. So rather than, oh, she's just a druggie,
Right.
And chaplains had other great insights like that. One chaplain said, I asked all the chaplains I interviewed, what have been the most difficult cases you've had? One chaplain said, well, I've learned with African-American women the hard way. He's a white chaplain, a white man. He said, to go in broken. When I have an African-American woman, I don't go in like I have my shit together and like everything's, I say, the food, if she's the food tracer, the food is just not what it should be, or, these hospitals are kind of chaotic, aren't they? And kind of walked in differently. And to sort of bond with the person. They were very attuned, in other words, to how to
each individual and maybe even learning more ways. Like the most important thing for them was to try to find a way to connect, whatever it meant.
Exactly right.
Like just to learn from,
Right. And
maybe to assume in that case, because of course you don't know, but just to assume a little bit, but then also to learn from and to adjust, because it's about the person and meeting the person where they are in that place. And
right, and to be able to, and therefore gain the person's trust. And
Right.
they tell many stories of how, as a result of that, that was helpful to the person from a mental health point of view, because
Right.
no one had respected them before, or they were just treated as.
Right. So what's the vision? So if we had more of that, then what?
Well, I think, people's mental health would be better. I think people would cope better at the end of life. I think families would deal better with grief when there's, horrible things happen in hospitals. People tell me, as a doctor, you get told all kinds of stories. Oh, you're a doctor. My husband died and the hospital screwed up and blah, 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 blah. And
Right.
you're
Horror
angry
stories, yeah.
Right. So I think people would realize, chaplains play a role as intermediaries because they're neither here nor there, which is both a blessing and a curse.
Right.
But they can bring more respect to the person. I think so. I think it can help with depression. I think it can help with anxiety. I think it can help with substance use. So
even in the example that you gave earlier, they would have saved $3 million in stomach
right.
inquiry. Like there's a whole element of the person that is not being honored, and that is medicinal, right, in ways that are different. It's different, yeah.
Yeah, and I happen to think, so when I was, as a medical student, I had to choose a mentor, so I chose Robert J. Lifton, who was on the medical school faculty at Yale when I was there, and he wrote a book called Nazi Doctors. He interviewed Nazi doctors, and before that, he was the first social scientist to study survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he interviewed them, what gives you meaning? And he said that people have a need for some kind of meaning in their lives, and he went on about that. I can talk about that. But I happen to think that the fentanyl pandemic in America, for instance, the fact that there's an opioid pandemic in this country, it's not because the Chinese are sending fentanyl to the U.S. It's because people have a need for meaning that's not being met in our culture today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people do have a need for meaning, for connection. Lifton described a sense of symbolic immortality that people have, that people need to feel that in some way will continue on. I was raised in Reform Judaism, and it was said, people still live on in the hearts of those who cherish them, for instance.
We're looking for another rabbi here at the Y, just so you know.
Oh, okay. I thought you're the rabbi.
My secret mission is to find another rabbi.
Right. So
the symbolic immortality, or logos, as Viktor Frankl termed it, like the sense of transcendent purpose, meaning, mission, whatever it might be, that's bigger than just the I that is sitting here, whatever it might be, and that there is an epidemic of anomie, of some would call like a yearning for dopamine, right, which is itself only a symptom of a yearning for meaning, right? We replace meaning with dopamine.
Right, and dopamine these days is from social media. So click, how many likes am I getting, whatever it is. So, but that's not the kind of meaning people need.
But you get to see, and you saw, how a simple question can open someone to healing, a simple inquiry, a mystery. Right. Like, what's it like for you, and how does it feel, and that itself has profound implications. What about the resistance to chaplaincy in the field?
Yeah, so there's a lot of resistance, and among patients and among physicians. And part of the reason I wrote this is to convince physicians that, we should pay more attention to what chaplains are doing. Look at all the amazing things they can do to help our patients. But chaplains, when I said to chaplains, what's the biggest challenges you face in most difficult cases, a lot of them talked about being rejected and how they come to terms with that. So one problem is the word chaplaincy is itself a Christian term. It comes from St. Martin of Tours, where there was a chapeau, a cape that was kept in a room that became a chapel, and the person took care of it was the chaplain, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we have a very diverse religious landscape in America today. And getting back to the issue of meaning, by the way, is the number of people who are spiritual but not religious, or believe in nothing in particular, is going way up. Nuns, right? None of the above. So particularly among young people, a third of young people are nothing in particular. But so when I asked chaplains about biggest challenges, they would talk about being rejected, and they had to come to terms with that. And when they were able to overcome that resistance, it was very helpful. So one chaplain, for instance, said he knocked on a patient's door and said, "I'm from the chaplaincy." And the woman put up a cross and said, "Get out, you're anathema to me. My religion is CNN. I believe in the facts and politics."
CNN, wow, okay.
Right? And he went, "Oh, okay," and then he left. And but he thought, she seemed sort of a lonely woman who no one visited her. So he went back the next day and knocked on the door and said, "Remember me?" And she went, "Yeah." And he said, I know your religion's CNN, but what do you think of what's going on in politics today?
I see, yeah.
And they talked, and of course there's a lot she had to say, and they ended up developing a relationship that was very helpful to her. No one else visited her. She was a lonely woman.
Yeah, it's great.
So I think...
It's like, there's a story in the Hasidic lineage. It just, my original thought was that when he came back, he was dressed as Anderson Cooper. And there's a story from Rav Nachman of Breslov, who was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. That's a famous story called The Turkey Prince. Have you ever heard the story? Essentially, the story is it's a story about a kingdom in which the prince of the kingdom one day wakes up and thinks he's a turkey, and he kind of takes off all his clothing and begins clucking and goes underneath the table. And the king summons all of the wise men in and says to them, obviously my son thinks he's a turkey. Can you please heal him? So one by one, they try to convince him he's not a turkey. They try to offer proofs. They try to they try to chastise him, try to make, who are you to say you're a prince? None of it works until finally, the last wise man, shows up, begins to disrobe and gets under the table. And the prince looks at him and starts clucking, and the wise man looks back and starts clucking. And one day passes, and then he starts speaking, and the prince says, "You can't speak, you're a turkey." He says, "I'm clearly a turkey, but clearly turkeys can speak." And he says, "Okay." And then he puts on his clothing, and he says, "Wait a second, you're a turkey, you can't put on clothes." He says, "Clearly I am a turkey, but turkeys can wear clothing, clearly." And little by little, right, the turkey prince kind of returns to his former life. And the story, of course, for Rav Nachman, or as any great healer, is that you have to find a way in whatever it takes, to kind of wear the clothing or the mind of the other until there's rapport and connection and trust, and then healing can manifest. So that's great.
It's a beautiful story.
Yeah, it's a good story. It should make it into your book next time, the second edition. So the resistance comes from
Yes, so
the spirituals who reject the kind of, and the word chaplain itself is kind of a bad mark. It's a kind of bad branding, because then you think that this person must definitionally be Christian or whatever it is, and if you're a CNN religionist or some other, right? So what are the resistance also from other doctors too? Doctors kind of...
So I actually wrote a little piece of this published in the Times a few years ago, in the New York Times, and it's just saying that doctors need to be more aware of patients' religion. I actually told a little story that I said about the woman who was Catholic, and I asked, should I call a priest, and et cetera. So there were 488 comments, and people wrote, doctors should not force their religion down patients' throats. And I thought, and I was going to respond, but then other people wrote, that's not what Klitzman's saying. He's not saying doctors should force their religion down people's throats, but religion is a touchy subject. I mean,
sure is. Famously,
people said, don't talk about religion and politics with friends. Everyone I know talks about politics these days, but that's another story.
Right. Exactly, adhere to one part of it, right?
Right. So
people have religious trauma too. I call it post-traumatic God disorder. If you've had a bad experience with religion, and most people have actually,
right,
then you're already predisposed to reject it, prima facie.
Right.
religion, keep it away from me. But Klitzman wasn't saying that. He was saying, what was he saying?
Right. So the chaplains tell a number of stories. So a number of issues come up, one with Muslim patients, and of course in a place like New York there's a lot of Muslim patients. Other also is with LGBT patients. So one chaplain said, because a lot of them have been rejected by their church or conservative or Orthodox synagogues, etc., but they still have spiritual, religious challenges, needs, etc. So as one chaplain said, she was called to, at the middle of the night, a patient wanted a Bible. So she went, and it was like midnight, and she brought this Bible, and it turned out the patient was raised evangelical, but was transgender. So she talked to the patient. The patient said, if God is so great, why did he put me in the wrong body? And the chaplain was taken aback. Like, how do you respond to this? But I think it woke the chaplain up to the fact that, there are things that even chaplains struggle with in terms of knowing how to respond, what to say. And also with Muslim patients. So one doctor I interviewed said he had a Muslim patient who just came over from the Middle East, and this is now his patient. And the Muslim patient said, "Doctor, do you believe in God?" And the doctor said, "I didn't know what to say." So I like, well, So finally he stumbled out, "Well, I do, but I'm Protestant." And the Muslim patients grabbed his hand and said, "Thank God you're a man of the book. You're a person of the book." It was because Muslims recognize the Old Testament and the New Testament. But there's a lot of, I was surprised how much challenge and difficulty there was on both sides. So one Muslim doctor I interviewed said, I asked him about religion and his work, et cetera. He said, "Well, I'm very concerned because patients get very mad at me." I said, "Why do they get mad?" And he said, "Well, patients say to me, 'Doc, what's going to happen? How will I do?' And he says, 'It's all in the hands of God.' Because in my religion," he says, "it's all in the hands of Allah." And patients get really upset. And I don't know why are they upset. Like, what should I say? I said, because they hear you as saying, it's up to God, it's not up to me. I have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
He said, "What should I say?" I said, "Well, you could say, we're going to do everything we can to help you. But in the end, it's in God's hands." And he said, "Oh, I never thought of that." So I think, and doctors miss these cues all the time. So this is a typical conversation. Doctor says, "How you doing?" to the patient. The patient says, "Well, I just hope God's ready for me." "Well, did you take your medicine this week?"
Yeah.
Did you make the follow-up appointment with the orthopedist or cardiologist? So they're just not trained, and so, but also they're uncomfortable with it. And so that's the underlying issue. They're not trained, they're uncomfortable which came first. They like having an answer, and to talk about these things we don't have an answer for is hard.
I'm so happy that you said that, because I was about to ask you.
Right.
Like, it would seem like maybe there are, either they're not trained, they're uncomfortable, and also a third option, which is not exclusive, but like a third option is that possibly the very skill set that is required to be an excellent physician is contraindicated in certain ways, or it's kind of those very skills are not the softer skills that are involved in. I mean, some people are unique in having emotional, intelligence, and so could be.
Well, I think doctors, what I say in the book, doctors need to have scripts ready. In other words, they need to know what to say when these topics come up. So, another doctor I interviewed said, a patient said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And the doctor, yeah, I do. Actually, I'm an agnostic. But what I mean by that is not agnosticism. And she goes on this whole, she said, "I realized the patient just wanted me to say yes or no." Like, she didn't want a whole diatribe on my views of agnosticism. So I think patients just need to be able to say, or, getting back to the title of the book, one surgeon I interviewed told me that he was wheeling a young boy into surgery, and he thought the kid wouldn't survive. And at the last minute, the family said, "Doctor, would you pray with us?" And they were Catholic. I think he was Jewish. And he said, "Well, no." And he walked away. And he said, "That's troubled me. And, what could I have said?" And I said, "Well, you could have said, well, I'm happy to stand here with you or support you." Because a lot of times patients really want to hear, when they're asking these questions, can I trust you? Are you a person with integrity? That's sort of what, they're really asking. But I think physicians are uncomfortable. It's partly the training. It's partly, as you say, they were schooled to think religiously. It's partly discomfort with religion and spirituality. We don't have answers. It's soft. We want an answer. But I think we need to realize that regardless of our own beliefs as physicians, we need to think what's in the patient's best interest. We need to get to know our patients, see what's important to them. How can we best help them? And I think that is there's a disconnect. There was a study that asked medical school deans, would you want more training on spirituality and religion? And the vast majority said no in the curriculum. So there's still this tension. I think we need to overcome that.
It's remarkable also just to think that integrity here means two separate things. So for that doctor, integrity means I won't lie about my discomfort with religion. I won't put on a face or whatever it might be in order to give succor to this person who needs it, because I have my integrity. I'm not going to in any way deceive them. But there is a kind of in the Jewish tradition there is the notion that sometimes a willingness to lie for the sake of something much bigger, or to put on or to act as if, is like a vital part of a relationship. In the story of Joseph and the brothers, his brothers at the end of the book of Genesis say that Jacob promised, told us to tell you, Joseph, to not take revenge against us when he's dead, after he's dead. Now, all the commentaries say that no such promise took place, but the brothers were actually, there was a white lie involved for the sake of the peace of the family, and it's looked upon well by the tradition as sometimes when someone asks you to pray with them and you're uncomfortable and you're an atheist, whatever it is, but their little boys or their young son is being brought into the operating room, just stand there.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And that's training, be a mensch, whatever it is, right? But it's a worldview that's here, that's at stake, like for this,
right.
for the institution of medicine. And what your book is pointing out is that this will be beneficial, but how do you work against 90% of those who don't want any training in it? It's really, maybe your book is the beginning, or your work.
Well, I hope. I mean, I've been speaking about it to medical audiences, trying to, and when you talk,
how's it received?
Well, people like it. I mean, I think people want to hear that, because I think physicians are uncomfortable, but I think a lot of physicians realize this is a need. And medicine is under strain. There's a lot of moral distress among doctors, and I should add, chaplains help with that. Chaplains help address, particularly during COVID when I did a lot of the interviews, chaplains do a lot of work helping physicians, particularly nurses, deal with the moral stress, the moral strain, their own getting burnt out, for instance. I mean, a lot of that deals with the soul in some way.
Is there gender stuff in the studies? Meaning, are chaplains, is chaplaincy itself as a profession, or some of the softer skills more commonly found in? Have they done studies on that?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. About chaplains, I think are probably 55% women, 45% men.
So it kind of mixes, yeah.
Yeah, and part of that also is that because it's not reimbursed, so a lot of men may be less drawn to that. Not good or bad, but that's just the fact of it.
Cultural, yeah.
Right. I should say, I find that a lot of the nurses were much more receptive to chaplains than were doctors. A lot of doctors still feel this is all, nonsense. And a lot of that, I think, is a problem with medicine. This is a whole other topic, perhaps. But we focus on curing. We're going to have the answer, we're going to cure, and of course, we often can't cure, we just heal. And there's resistance to palliative care and hospice, which is growing as a movement, but there's still some uneasiness about it. We should be focusing on curing the patient, not on just making them comfortable. And I think there's a growing realization that's not realistic. And of course, particularly as America is getting older, more people are aging, more people are going to need hospice and palliative care, and their attitude shifting. Chaplains, by the way, I think are more respected in palliative care and in hospice than in other areas of medicine.
Because at that point, it's already a foregone conclusion to some extent that the physical encasement or the body is
right.
There's no cure. It's almost like there is a moment where, how do we make this person more comfortable? And so they see meaning making as a kind of comfort. It's kind of like a morphine of sorts, Right. Before that, you don't really need that much meaning, as long as we could save you.
Right.
So I have just one last question. I want to make sure that there's time for people here who've come to. I'm almost in such a deep conversation with you that I forgot that there were people here, and your remarkable presence. Like, I know you're not a chaplain, but I would love to have your chaplaincy of some kind. You're really a great listener and communicator. And then we'll open this up. But I just want to talk about prayer, like in the phrase, will you pray for me? And I know that in my work in rabbinical school and chaplaincy and with friends, that was almost for us for me as a rabbi. I was so used to having set prayers, the scripts, that you were talking about for doctors, that one of the things that I loved about chaplaincy was that it was alive and organic. Like I had to meet the person who was there and find a prayer that fit them.
Yes.
And it forced me to find words that I might not have used, but that also opened me.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And kind of creative, innovative prayer life, right? The prayer for the moment, prayer in the room. Right. It was really on the ground, like,
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have maybe any prayers that you've heard, or any, were you ever in the presence of a really beautiful prayer moment that stuck with you? You have so many wonderful stories, but is there?
Yeah, so I was struck how, for a lot of these terms, prayer, what is prayer? People define prayer differently. So there were set prayers, as people say, but one woman I interviewed, I think was Jewish, but sort of an atheist. She's culturally Jewish.
There she is.
There she is now, right? Sorry. It was CBS News calling. They interviewed me today about something.
Oh, great. Get the book out. So CBS News, 92
Anyway,
NY.
I'll have to call him later. But prayer.
This woman, she's a Jewish.
Yes, so she said, I don't believe in God, she said. But sometimes I get on my knees and pray to the God I don't believe in.
Oh.
And I thought, that's kind of profound. I mean, that kind of, why not? Sort of Pascal's wager.
Yeah, well, no atheists in the hospital room.
Right. But then I interviewed an African-American woman who had HIV in the Bronx. And she said, she was rejected by the church because she had used drugs. And she said, but sometimes I go to the Hudson River, there's a park there, and just look at the water. And when I can't go there, I just turn the sink on in my bathroom and put my hand under it and feel the water. And that, to me, is a special time. And to me, that was a prayer. That was sort of she felt this connection to something beyond her.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So I think people pray in different ways from a script, as you say. And I think chaplains are amazing in that they're able to sort of formulate, prayers. In fact, so one of the first chaplains I interviewed was an elderly nun. And I said, well, tell me what you do. And she said, well, this morning I went and knocked on a patient's curtain, and I said, I'm from the chaplaincy department. And the man in the bed said, no, we don't need you. But his wife said, no, come in. And she said, I can either give you a prayer or good wishes. And he said, well, we don't want a prayer, but we'll take good wishes. And she turned to me and said, I basically say the same thing either way. She says, I say, may Joe here, may the doctors who are operating on Joe here today have, the wisdom, all the wisdom possible. May the forces of the universe give them strength and know-how. May Joe start with a new life and a new beginning and a fresh start. And he grabbed her hand and said, thank you so much. so he was going to take a prayer, but he'd take good wishes. So right. I think, the ways we define this, and even terms like what do we, at one point I thought of calling the book, but then another book had this title, what do we talk about when we talk about God?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of how people from all different religions and backgrounds, and I interviewed evangelical patients and chaplains who deal with evangelicals and people who are atheists, agnostic, Jewish, Muslim. People are looking for the same thing in the end. They're looking for meaning and purpose and connection and hope, and they may term it different things.
Right.
What is grace? What is prayer? What is spirituality? But it's similar things that people are seeking.
Right. Because I often say in the synagogue that I founded, don't let God get in the way of a good prayer service.
Say it again.
Don't let God
get
in the way of a good prayer service.
Yeah, right.
This, the idea, like this remarkable story of the Jewish atheist who gets on her knees, like the impulse to pray is the impulse to connect to something either greater than you or deeper than the self. Something, profoundly in whose presence, in the experience of it, one feels contextualized, one feels connected, one feels something that isn't only discovered, let's say, in your normal waking consciousness. And so she's throwing herself on the ground. She doesn't know what she believes in, or she doesn't believe in something, but she's praying to the God she doesn't believe in. I would love her to pray to the God that she does believe in, and let that God be whatever she believes in, but and have it be worthy of prayer. But all of that is really wonderful. As a person who, my own rabbinate has been marked by a deep yearning to make prayer come alive for people in some way, shape, or form. I found your stories already to be very evocative and very beautiful. I'd love, is it okay if we just ask a couple questions from people? Yes. If anybody would like to ask a question or make an inquiry or follow up on something, do we need to I'll just repeat the questions yeah. Go ahead, yeah. So should I repeat that for those who are online? So we're at a particular point in time right now within the body politic where you're saying we are all ill, and you're asking Dr. Klitzman if he has any advice, practical advice on what to do with that predicament that we find ourselves in.
I'll say the following. I wish I could wave my magic wand and make the world a better place, but that's not possible. I think one issue is self-care, and the other is changing the politics that we now have. So self-care, I think, getting back to prayer, I think gratitude prayers, just being grateful for what we do have. We have an uncertain world, and for me, and I think for many people, a president and a political system that's taking us the wrong way, away from values that we care about deeply. I think one is to be grateful for what, we live in a wonderful city. Many of us have our health. We have people who love us. We're part of a community of people who share values. The midterm elections are coming up in, a year and a half.
So focusing on the future and potential agency that we might have. So
yes, exactly. But also the present.
Agency,
it's easy to think, this is all terrible going down the drain, but there's still a lot that we have. We live in a blue city, in a blue state. And I think history is cyclical. I think we've been through bad periods in the past, and
so kind of like telling ourselves stories, like being able to interject, as some would say,
yes, right.
various voices or various salient wisdom that can help support us in this moment. But also practices like a gratitude practice is a beautiful practice.
Yes,
right? Appreciation practice, like similar like things that you see that are beautiful. I love that. I love that you're pointing people to mindfulness practices and midterms.
Mindfulness and midterms. I would say one other thing, which I've been looking at Trump's approval and disapproval ratings. And the approval ratings are dropping and the disapproval ratings are going up. And it's only been a month, but he started out with about an 8-point approval over disapproval. Now it's down to 2 points in a month. So at that rate,
we're getting better.
But I think I would just say also, I think that I try to engage with the other side. We all know someone, everyone I know knows someone who voted for Trump, a cousin's girlfriend or boyfriend or, a coworker, and try to engage and understand. It's a whole other topic of why we're in the mess we're in. But I think mindfulness and midterms, if I just sum up in 3 words.
I also love, though, that if you think about chaplains as, intensely available at moments of liminality or transitions that are of great, of ultimate meaning, right? When you're around somebody who's in a room or who's wheeling their kid in, you're not red or blue, right?
Yes, right.
And so chaplains in particular have a practice and a skill set, which is to cut through very important differences, cut through very important diversities that we all, thank God in our country we can have diversity in various forms. Not enough in certain ways, too much in other ways, but a chaplain is able to find the essence of it, and that's kind of like chaplain eyes or chaplain heart or chaplain mind.
Yes.
is looking at the person as the whole person, not just their political opinion, right? And that's a hard practice at this moment, but it's still a practice, right? To see the pains, the sufferings, the things that they're struggling with. And that's especially hard if we think that they're to blame, if the other person is to blame for suffering that will come to us or the loved ones. And that's a tricky place, but still, it's still a practice, a spiritual practice of wholeness. So,
yes, I think also, I mean, I'm struck that I see Christian voices saying that what Trump is doing is not Christian. Like I saw something on the internet that was a message on Facebook or something that, if you're Christian, how could you let kids starve and take away food that was helping them survive, for instance? And I think
it's very pastoral what that remarkable minister did.
Yes,
the bishop,
right, correct,
Bishop
right.
Buddy.
I mean, I would hope.
Mercy.
Tell me if you disagree, that there are that religious leaders from across different faiths could combine more on this. I would hope that Christian leaders of churches, rabbis, imams could get together and say, this is not a view of the world that we share, and we can work together. Remember, in midterm elections, no more than half the people vote. And what I heard is that if 80,000 people had voted differently, there'd be a different person in the White House. So I think to get the people who didn't vote to vote would make a big difference.
Okay, we're going to move to, I think I saw Eden's hand up, and I'll repeat your question. So.
It's actually not a question.
Okay,
I
sure.
want to share an experience that affirms your thesis about chaplaincy. So in 2015, my mother was dying, and she was in the ICU, and she was intubated. And it was existentially, it was the first moment in my life where I had no parent who could speak to me. And so I was alone in the ICU with her, and a Catholic chaplain came, and he was there to check on her, but she wasn't available. And he came and checked on me every day.
Wow.
And I was alone. I didn't have no one visiting her, it was just me. And I wasn't involved in a spiritual community. I wasn't involved in religion in any concrete way, but I was absolutely on a journey. And so this religious man showed up in my life and had a huge impact on me. And it was, she was in the hospice she was in the ICU and the hospice for about 2 weeks. And it was a few days after meeting that chaplain that I came to a Jewish community for the first time, which is Rabbi Ingber's community. And it was just hearing me speak. I always knew that that chaplain had a huge impact on me and helped me, and in such just a practical way. We didn't pray. I don't think we talked about God at all. He just sat with me. And it's also the foray into my religious life, which is the center of my life now.
So I feel so badly that people online might not have heard. It's an amazing story from a woman here with us, Eden, who shared how her mother in 2015 was dying, and she had been intubated. And Eden, who had already lost her father, but only her mother was surviving, found herself for the first time in her life without her parental figure there for her. And in the midst of that isolated experience, a Catholic chaplain showed up and provided presence, didn't speak about God necessarily, but just was, day in and day out showing back up to be with you. And so that was like underscoring Dr. Klitzman's his thesis.
So first of all, thank you for sharing. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad that you found a community that's supportive for you. And that's another thing about religion, of course, is it's also supportive in a social way. And I find other stories like that, some which I put in the book. But I would just say one thing, which is at some point, if you're open to it, you might want to just send the chaplain a note and just thank him or her.
Yeah, it was a long time ago now, but I remember him for sure.
Yeah, because I think chaplains I interviewed, they struggle too. I mean, they get rejected. It's a hard life.
Yeah,
it's a hard job. They get burnt out. And often hearing that is enormously gratifying to them, just if you have the bandwidth for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hi.
So you started from the biological, right? That psycho is some like
So yes.
There's scientific proofs to it.
Yes, so there are studies that show that people who have more religiosity on a scale, I mean, that's important to them, have thicker white matter in parts of their brain, which is thought to give them more neural reserves, and they're less depressed. And this has been found very systematically, scientifically. Now, of course, it's not clear which came first, if they have more neural reserves and are less depressed and therefore are more religious, or if they're more, so it's not, that hasn't been worked out, but clearly that's a very clear finding that it actually buffers against depression. It may be, in other words, that people who are more depressed have less religion because they're less believing something as a symptom of depression, but it's clearly there, and the people who've done the research seem to think that it actually is the religiosity that helps buffer against adversity. I've also been struck that there are certain kinds of epilepsy where people get hyper-religious. So it's definitely encoded partly in the brain.
When I listen to you talk about chaplains and spirituality, I can't help but think of sports coaches who work with athletes and do some of the same things in boosting people's morale. They kind of use different words than spirituality. I'm just curious to know if you've looked at that or considered that in any way.
You know, I haven't, but I think there's something there to what you're saying. And a lot of what chaplains do with people who are facing death and dying is have them reframe their experience. In other words, think of more positive ways of looking at what they're going through. And my sense is that's probably a common feature of what a coach would do, either a life coach or perhaps some psychotherapist, but sort of a sports coach. I remember one of the stories I tell was a chaplain who told me that he went to see a patient who was dying, grisly old guy who says, I've been a mean son of a bitch. I haven't seen my kids in years. Now I'm still here. What the hell am I here for? I don't even know while I'm still alive. He had a short lifespan, but was still here. Why aren't I dead already? What's the point of my being alive right now? I've been an asshole. And so the chaplain, and the patient was Christian, the chaplain was Christian, sort of on the patient's food tray was a piece of bread. And the chaplain picked up the piece of bread and said, let's just talk about bread for a moment. Maybe, and the guy had said, I haven't done much with my life, I've been a waste. And he said, maybe the point of life isn't to accomplish great things or, have done great things, but just to enjoy the present. Think about bread for a minute. It tastes good, it comes from the earth, it's nutritious. Jesus said he's the bread of life. Maybe the point of life is just to enjoy the present and be here in the present. And the patient really responded to that and said, thank you. That really, it turned out to be very helpful for that man. So, and then said, you can still call your kids, et cetera, et cetera. So I think being in the present, reframing things. One chaplain was talking to a patient who was going to be in a wheelchair. And said, I'm going to be in a wheelchair. I'm not going to do all these things. And the chaplain said, look, but things you still can do, for instance. So, and again, there's no psychotherapists in hospitals at this point. It's really the chaplain who sort of plays these roles. So I think there are analogies.
I think the term that I love the most is the whole person, healing the whole person. And I think that, my own experience in my own lifetime is that there are two extremes. There are multiple extremes, but there are two extremes in this conversation between the denial of the interior and the focus, the hyper-focus, and on the outside, on healing not the whole person, but the physical person. And then there's the other extreme, which we also see where people give too much credence to what's going on, on the inner plane, and give it too much of weighting
Right.
in terms of its causal, causal assumptions, really. But somewhere in there, we all know intuitively that you can have a stomach ache because on January 21st, 2021, right, you lost your wife, and you haven't cried it out, and you have migraines because of grief that you haven't, expressed. And sometimes if you focus too much on that, you will not go to the doctor to get an x-ray for your clearly dislocated, your herniated disc. And so the whole person idea, and that somehow, especially in the hospital, where there's such great vulnerability, there isn't a balance in the whole person model. And the chaplains come, right, to bring some of that balance back. And I think that's a great teaching for a moment now where we tend to think in extremes and a more balanced approach.
Yes, totally. A few years ago, I was in Greece, and I went to Epidaurus, which is the site of the largest intact Greek theater from the ancient world. It seats 10,000 people, and famously, if you drop a pin on the stage, all 10,000 people hear it. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a famous place. But what I didn't realize, it was actually part of a compound for Hippocrates. It was for Asclepius, who was the Greek god of healing, and the two snakes entwined around the staff. And so actually there was a hospital there. There was a hospital, a temple, and a theater. And I thought, what a wonderful image or model to have, not just a hospital, but have there a temple and a theater. And I think what happened is in the 19th century, the late 19th century, when medicine became more scientific and we discovered that germs cause disease, which before the 1870s, no one knew that it was Pasteur who discovered it, that germs cause disease. It was thought disease are from God or whatever. And so medicine said, well, we're going to be... What's that?
Or the Jews.
Or the Jews, right. So
had to put that in there.
Boils, killing the firstborn.
Blood,
right.
Something.
So, and I thought that, I think that as medicine became more scientific in the late 19th century and early 20th century, medicine said, well, we're going to be scientific, and all this other stuff is quackery. And the problem is, and that's still where we are, the problem is, of course, that if you're the patient experiencing the illness, it's all combined. As I said, these doctors who said they suddenly realized only when they became patients that existential, spiritual, religious issues are important. The notion that, they're separate is ridiculous. It's like saying, no, my right hand and my left hand are not connected. Well, they're not, but there's the whole body between them.
Right. Well, speaking, I think, for myself, I think I also probably am speaking for all of you here that this was a deeply illuminating conversation. And if you haven't read the book, I imagine having heard this conversation, you might want to go read the book. And to that end, there are books in the back that are available for purchase. And I'm pretty sure that Dr. Klitzman would be happy to sign them. I no idea what CBS News wants from you, but I hope that they want your book and its findings, and especially the anecdotes, which are priceless, to somehow influence a bit more of a paradigm shift. I think that you had me at Doctor, will you pray for me? Because as a rabbi, I vitally see the connection between the heart, the mind, and spirit and the body. And so I just want to say kudos to you, and thank you so much for allowing us to be in conversation tonight. And thank you all for coming out tonight to listen. And I hope that something tonight might also have opened your heart and your mind, that you might have something from tonight's conversation that will both be applicable in your life, but also lead you to read this book and to hope that chaplains are available for as many of our loved ones as we can possibly, imagine having a loved one. My father's 91, my mother is 84, and when I think about their infirmity, and thank God they're well, but many of the stories you told tonight about wanting someone around them who is asking the right questions and providing the right presence is really vital. So thank you so much, Doctor. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for coming.